I am exhausted and I am on my way home, and it's still quite a bit of a drive still. I got 20 minutes, so I figured why not talk about something. So I've watched Haunting or Hill House or whatever, The Haunting at Hill House or whatever the heck the movie's called. Anywho, I've watched it several times. I've watched some reaction videos and I've listened to people talk, and it's interesting because if I went back to like some of the things that I have spoken about, like in therapy, and some of the things that were in my nightmares, I think the reason why this show, I think I said movie, didn't I? I'm sorry, I'm tired. Anywho, I think why this hit so hard and I understood the psychological aspect more than the horror aspect was because I had my own Hill House. I had my own Hill House. It wasn't this scary mansion. It didn't have any, workers come in or anything like that. But it really made me think, and it made me think of the reason why I started writing books, and was because I guess I should backtrack. So when I spoke at my father's funeral, I spoke about the little yellow house. And that was so easy for me to write it out, to think about it, and all the good memories, because that's where a lot of my good memories started. Well, I noticed I started having trouble when we moved up the county a little bit to the house that I grew up in for most of my life up until late high school. And I realized it was because those memories, those good memories, started to trickle and fade, and it opened a door, in a sense, to some scary realities of, like, so what I'm trying to say is, like, so I can understand the mom's point of view is, like, it's scary out in the real world. The real world is scary. It wants to eat you and devour you and hurt you. Well, that's kind of how I felt when my world was shattered, starting at age 8 is all I can remember, is always age 8. So that's when my trauma started. That's when bad things started happening to me. So that's when that's when death was introduced into my life. That's when I really, really understood death, and I've seen people die, and I've seen people hurt, and I was hurt myself, and I almost died, So it's like, that's where the trauma happened. So a lot of times in my nightmares, I would have dreams where I was always in that house. Now the house, there are certain things in that house that always look the same, and I was usually always in my bedroom, which I could kind of understand, like, is the red room. That was my happy space. That was my safe place. That's where I had stuffed animals wrapped around me at nighttime when I was scared. That's where I played with my toys. That's where my imagination grew. It's where I would play in my ginormous closet and, pretend I was camping, or that's where I felt safe, was in that room. But then that safety started to slip away because there was also things that trickled in. So I could understand the fear of the darkness, if you will. That's where this beautiful, wonderful place, this light room, started to trickle in the darkness. And so I was thinking about, like, the mold on the walls in the red room. And I'm like, oh my God, I can understand the kind of metaphor or analogy to that, is because mold spreads. When it's not taken care of, mold spreads, and it's dark and it's dank and it's gross, and it consumes you, and it can make you sick, and it can make you paranoid. It can do all kinds of things. So it made me think about how that those series of dark events in my life started to trickle out like mold on the wall. And while there were some light spots there, that darkness consumed. So then, you fast forward to things that I had done out in the real world, in school, and the bad, horrible things that I was experiencing, the bullying, the abuse, my mind being so unsure and screwed up and not comfortable in my own skin. And then you look into adulthood and all the mistakes that I probably made, or the bad choices that I probably made, and all this guilt, all this horrible guilt that I felt because of those things, those previous things, you know, it's an effect because I never got help for myself. I never understood I needed help for myself. So I relate so much to Nell, a lot. Very childlike, very traumatized. I wouldn't say I saw my own bent neck lady, but there was times I could look in the mirror, and it was something I said during when I admitted myself into the hospital, was I could picture my own reflection as this scary evil, and this was before Hill House, by the way, this was like 6 years ago, this, like a witch, like this horribly unkept, snarling, unhappy, angry thing is how I could picture myself, and it scared the hell out of me. But there was times where, you know, I would have, you know, thoughts of people being next to me in bed, and I think about the nightmares, my own ghost, if you will, haunting me. So I think of that as like the flashbacks because of my trauma, things that I was uncomfortable with, the guilt that I felt of doing something wrong or making poor decisions, and the horrible, heavy guilt that I felt haunted me. And I have never been able to relate to a show before in my entire life. Usually they were always escapes. And like, so for instance, I'll watch The Vampire Diaries when I'm playing The Sims, or I'll listen to it, or I always watch Jer Bear Reacts. I love him, he's so funny. And there's certain aspects that I watch of The Vampire Diaries that makes me laugh with him. And I always make a joke saying I would make a horrible vampire because I have way too much empathy. I could not hurt anybody because the guilt that I would feel, I would turn my humanity off. There's no doubt, because of the way my mind dissociates. Whenever something bad or negative happens, my brain has always dissociated, and I'm really working hard for it to not dissociate. So I feel like the writer of this show hit something hard that I can relate to, because it was my truth. It still is sometimes my truth, the things that I go through. I'm getting better. You know, I don't have the nightmares as bad, but it is paralyzing fear. It is the unknown. It is the heavy guilt. It is wanting to build a brick wall and brick yourself in and not feel anything. And then you feel too much. You feel everything. You pick up on people's energies because, you know, that's just what your brain does, because you're searching for dangers. And so you learn to block yourself off, or you become cold, or you go into denial where you don't believe any of it, and you try to over-rationalize everything. Everything has a rational explanation. So for me as a writer, I can really appreciate that, because I've always wanted, and I'm almost jealous, I've always wanted to write my truth into a story. And I kind of started to with the very first book that I wrote, but when I went back and read it, I couldn't rewrite the book because I hated the main character, because I saw myself, the weak self that I was, who was unsure. And so now I'm in a spot where I want to turn that around. So a lot of my writing is going to be, sometimes, sure, I am going to be the villain. I am also going to be the hero of my own story. And I never realized, like, you know, I love fairy tales, don't get me wrong, but there's so much enjoyment of watching, like, so for Maleficent's backstory, I enjoyed that so much because she was hurt and she lashed out, and we're not saying that's okay, but she also became the hero of her own story. She didn't need these things that we think of, you know, true love or this and that. True love comes in many forms. So, but back to Hill House. I left my own Hill House. And I think a lot of us did that are like me, that have CPTSD, but it never clicked. It never made more sense to me and a way to describe what it's like living with trauma. And I cannot applaud the writers of this show and the directors. Oh my God. I mean, it was just done beautifully. It really, really was. So for somebody like me, yeah, kudos to you, because there's no better way to explain what we go through.